This episode of The Young Turks is brought to you by Audible.com.
The War Powers Act was put in, it's a resolution that was agreed to at a joint session of Congress in 1973, which says that the president is mandated to go to Congress for any kind of military action abroad unless it is immediately necessary for defense or in an emergent situation. The War Powers Act is always invoked by people who are angry that the War Powers Act wasn't adhered to. Generally speaking, during Afghanistan and especially during Iraq, I mean, Afghanistan, it would seem, at that time, in the wake of 2001 and 9/11, a lot of people would have seen that as, an immediate reaction to something that had happened here, thus not demanding the powers of the War Powers Act. However, going into Iraq, a lot of Democrats were infuriated over the fact that the president went into Iraq, President Bush went into Iraq, almost unilaterally without going to Congress to get acceptance, without putting it to the floor of the Congress to invoke the War Powers Resolution. Well, now, of course, there are Democratic lawmakers and Republican lawmakers, but mainly Republicans, who were upset that the president went into Libya and did things without consulting Congress. Congress is always upset whatever the president does, and it seems like the presidents never used the War Powers Act. I think it was largely built to keep us out of conflicts like Korea and Vietnam. It was enacted in 1973, which was less than 20 years after Korea and certainly in the thick of the end of the Vietnam War. But it was, it was built to avoid those sorts of conflicts. It had good intentions, but no president has really ever adhered to it. President George H.W. Bush went there to Congress, talked to them about going into Kuwait. There was opposition and there was support. It seemed like it went the way it should go. There were some very passionate, I remember passionate speeches on the floor of Congress endorsing President Bush, the father's efforts in going into Kuwait. And then there were some that were, of course, excoriating him for same. But the War Powers Act, the statute President Obama invoked when he launched forces in March, requires presidents to secure congressional approval for military operations within 60 days or withdraw forces during the next 30. Well, now Congress is saying, wait a second, are you going to comply with this? There were six six Senate Republicans asking him whether or not he intended to stick by that. Rand Paul, of course, of Kentucky, Jim DeMint of South Carolina, Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, John Cornyn of Texas, and Mike Lee of Utah. Three of those are new senators. Four of them are new senators. This is what Paul said. Friday is the final day of the statutory 60-day period for you to terminate the use of the United States Armed Forces in Libya under the War Powers Resolution. So, it's one of these things that is only convenient when the other party is in power. You wouldn't see these Republicans writing the same letter to George Bush about going into Iraq 30 days after we were in Iraq. Remember that? You remember when all those Republicans said, well, President Bush, it's time to get out. It's been 30 days. We're in Iraq 30 days. It's been a month, man. Let's get him out. No, there's nothing like that. It's just holding a president's feet to the fire because you can. It's all public relations. And of course, there are Democrats that are against it as well. And it sets a bad precedent for these presidents to do that. However, there's not a president since this was put into power that has sent Americans abroad that has not bypassed the War Powers Act. So somebody should have the gumption to go in front of the House and say, listen, why do we have this? I mean, nobody ever adheres to it. Do we have it just so we have letters that we can write to the president, that we can go on television and we can do a press conference about how the War Powers Act was bypassed? I mean, either use it or don't use it. And Libya, according to Bruce Ackerman, a professor of law and political science at Yale, the Libyan war is a classic case of what could go wrong with executive war making. So, we are trying to prevent that with the War Powers Act, but it hasn't done that. We count on our presidents. The party of the president always supports whatever the president does, in majority, not all of them. I'm not saying exclusively. I mean, Denis Kucinich is one of the loudest protesters to what's going on in Libya. And I suspect that the United States would say, we're not really at war with Libya. We're now part of a NATO coalition, so it's not really being at war. I mean, there are all sorts of gray areas here with this. But the point is, if you're going to have the War Powers Act, stick to it. And if you're not, just get rid of it, because it's ridiculous. Nobody uses it except as a way of talking to, the opposition president. And I don't think that's really what it was there for, and I don't think that's going to happen.
Audible.com is the leading provider of audiobooks.
In fact, they have over 75,000 titles.
And you can listen on your iPod or your MP3 player. You can listen to it anywhere, at any time. It's incredibly convenient.
And they have books in every single genre imaginable. You can get a free audiobook if you go to audiblepodcast.com/TYT.
Totally true.